But what I want to do for today's lecture is to go through macromolecules. Like, what are our major dietary macromolecules? And for each set out of those three, I want you to know what is that group made out of? What are the components of that macromolecule? Why do we particularly need that one? And how do we get them in our diet? So the three macromolecules, I'm going to go ahead and write them here, are carbohydrates, lipids, or fats, and proteins. And when you look on nutrition labels, like they are pretty much dividing those out in this region right here. So, do you all look at nutrition labels? Like I didn't when I was young. And they've sort of changed over the years. So it's got, what's the calories? We'll talk about that on Monday. How much fat and cholesterol. This group right here, if you've got slides, you could write, these are all lipids together. Total fat, including saturated and trans. Cholesterol is technically a lipid too. They put sodium on its own. That's odd. It's not. That's how important sodium is in your body. So we already talked about it raises your blood pressure, yes. Sodium is so important it gets its own line in this major section. Sodium is not a macromolecule. It's an ion. It's hugely important, but it's not included in macromolecules. Carbohydrates, including these groups, all of those are carbohydrates. And then protein down at the bottom.
Once you multiply the calories by 8, because this is 8 servings per container.
Depends on what that is. And whether you want to, like, eat all of it. What's your serving? I started this year eating like the actual serving of cereal. It's just so
That's really sad.
And I don't know what this is. I went and Googled this.
It's probably like some kind of pasta.
It's something pretty good for you. It's got all of the things. Could be protein enriched pasta, but it's kind of fatty. I don't know what it is. I looked for 2 minutes and I was like, I gotta move on. All of the macromolecules depend on carbon chemistry. And this is not a chemistry lecture, it's more of a review. But carbon is critical to building all of these. And all of those nutrients, when we eat them, we can get carbon building blocks out of those materials. This is important to us as carbon-based life forms. We've got to have those carbon structures. So I wanted this, I'm really not going to talk about chocolate and caffeine. They are actually not nutritional powerhouses. But this is to show when you see structures like this, carbon is so important that it's implied at the angles. You remember that? Do you learn that in health chemistry? Like, I don't think anyone ever literally said that, but then I went, way far in science. Carbon is here, 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 here. It's so important that it's just assumed that it's there. We don't even write it in all the time. That's how much carbon is important to us. The reason carbon is so important to these macromolecules and so important to life structures is that it has 4 valence electrons. 4 valence electrons. Does that make you anxious?
Yes, I hate chemistry.
Valence electrons are really important, actually. And carbon has 4 valence electrons, thus it can form 4 bonds covalently with other stuff. And I know this is a review for you, but this is why it matters. Carbon can bond with any other 4 molecules, technically. And that makes it like this kind of Lego. We have probably
I was wondering
10,000 Legos at my house at least. Why this slide?
Yeah.
Because this kind of Lego.
No, I get it now, but
You get it
I was
now.
looking at the slides, I was
Yeah.
like,
Why is
why?
Yeah, and these have a particular name, but I don't remember what it is. But If you have one of these, it lets you build off of it in any direction. This is actually a 6. It's a little bit better than carbon. It's got 4 sides, a top, bottom. But carbon is kind of like that kind of versatile building block that you can build big structures off of it. Like this stuff. So the point of this is not for you to memorize structures, but to look what kind of structures carbon can build. So you can make very large molecules if you're using a lot of carbons, because there's just so much bondability there. You can make big molecules, you can make branched molecules, you can have several different atoms bonded to carbon. If it's just carbons and hydrogens in a region, we say that's hydrocarbon. So these are all hydrocarbons because there's not any other atom in there. Actually, everything on here is hydrocarbon. Carbons can double bond. You remember that? That's important too. So you can use 2 of the bondable sites to build a double bond. And double bonds have different angles than single bonds. That's going to come up in a minute.
Question. When you said 4 outer shell electrons, is that the same thing as valence electrons?
For this class, yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the next important thing that helps with this concept of nutrition and macromolecules and calories eventually is that when you have covalent bonds, those store energy. Covalent bonds are a form of potential energy. And in general, the more bonds that you have in a molecule, the better fuel source it is, because the more bonds, the more energy. I didn't get that until, I didn't really get that until I was way out of college. And I was like, what? That's a helpful concept. So if you break bonds, you release some of the energy and you can capture it for your life functions. So looking back at this, every bond that we see on here is holding energy. This is a little bit bigger than this. It's a 3-carbon hydrocarbon. This is a 2-carbon hydrocarbon. This has more bonds. This has more energy. This would be a better fuel. Seem okay? Here's another picture I love. This is showing chemicals like with their atomic radius, what their real 3D shape is. So the black in between there, those are carbons. The white are hydrogens. I think the reds are oxygen. Yeah, reds are oxygen. So this is a triglyceride, actually. This is octane, like that goes in your car. I love this picture. It's so great. Yeah, bonds for fuel, bonds for fuel. And people have made cars that run on waste cooking grease. Totally makes sense when you look at how these are. And you think of bonds are energy. If you break them, you could use the energy. So in an engine, these are being burned and combusted for energy. In our body, we're doing digestion to break this down bond by bond, and we get energy out of it. I like that concept. Okay, so that's big concept number 1. Big molecules have more bonds have energy. I really could use another sentence here. So really, this should come first. There's some large macromolecules that are built out of small repeated parts. Sometimes you can take some small chemical and just join a bunch of those together and you get a large molecule. If that's the case, we call the large molecule a polymer and the small subunits monomers. So here's an example with colorful green balls. So if you have one of the subunits, that's a monomer. And if they join together chemically to form a longer chain of that thing repeated, that's a polymer. When our body does this, this is us building something bigger. So examples of us doing this in our body, and this happens through a dehydration reaction. That's actually not that important for this class, but it's a good review of a concept. When we do this in our body, we would be doing anabolism. Did we talk about that in here? I have not talked about it in this class this semester. So anabolism is where you're taking a small building block and turning it into a larger molecule. Like when we build muscle, we are doing this process. We're taking small pieces of protein, small building blocks of protein, making a bigger protein, help us create muscle. Or if we're going to build new DNA, we're going to take bases, ATGCs, and join them together into a longer chain, a polymer. Or when we are building glycogen, we would be doing that process. This process requires energy because we're making bonds. We're putting small things together and bonding them together into something larger. This has more energy than those two separately. This requires energy to do, so I'm going to write that in a different color. These anabolic or anabolism processes require energy. But life does that. Life builds big out of small and creates complexity. There's also a reverse to that process. So you can have a polymer or some larger molecule, and largely water helps to break those bonds. So if you've heard, you need to drink water so you can digest. Chemically true. Chemically true. Like you literally need water to help you break down large molecules into small and do that hydrolysis. That process, this would be catabolic or catabolism. And I want to make this statement match what I wrote over there. So we're taking a larger molecule, breaking it into smaller pieces, and along the way we're going to break bonds, release energy. Go from larger to smaller. So examples of this are we digest food. And I'm going to be, in this section, I'm going to be talking about catabolic processes like a lot in this class. I don't so much talk about the anabolic. But when we do this, we get pieces and energy, both. To build back up, you need pieces and you need energy to do this. So let's write the energy. I did write requires energy for what? Requires energy to build bonds. Make those concepts match. You need energy to make bonds because bonds are energy. You get energy when you break bonds because bonds are energy. The more bonds, the better the fuel. That's the start to metabolism and nutrition. Okay, so now we're going to start going through our groups. First big group, carbohydrates. So when each time we get to one of the macromolecule groups, I want to be able to go through and answer these questions. So first major group, major macromolecules, is carbohydrates. I'm going to discuss what are the building blocks of carbohydrates. Why do we need them? We do need them. We do need them, people. How do we get them? So let's answer that stuff for carbohydrates. Carbs. Okay. We need carbohydrates because our cells are set up to burn carbohydrates. They're the most preferred energy source. That is the easiest energy source for our body to use for fuel is carbohydrates. And the building blocks of carbohydrates are monosaccharides. Those are the monomers, monosaccharides, or simple sugars. I've got up there single sugar. They are single sugars. They are also what we call simple sugars. And normally, the ones that people prefer to use are going to be 5 or 6 carbon sugars. Don't worry about the actual structures, but notice they are drawing here a sugar as a green hexagon. And that's going to be repeated through these slides. So this is a monosaccharide, this green hexagon. It's a single sugar. It's a preferred fuel. Oh, examples include. Here are the examples. Major ones used by people. Glucose. Glucose is the big one. Fructose. And the third is galactose. Galactose. Different than lactose. So those in people, those are our major simple sugar building blocks. Those on their own, that's a lot of bonds. That's a good fuel. This is what we use in aerobic respiration, glycolysis. That's our major preferred fuel. If you're going to build simple sugars together into a longer polymer, you start by joining 2 singles and having a double sugar or a disaccharide. So here's an example. 1 molecule of galactose, 1 molecule of glucose. If they bond together, we call that lactose, which is milk sugar. It's also a disaccharide. So some examples of other examples of disaccharides besides lactose. Lactose is one. Sucrose. That's table sugar. Domino sugar, that's sucrose. Lactose, sucrose. Third one I'm going to put is maltose. Those are not the only ones in the world, but those are the ones that are most relevant to people and most relevant to when we talk about digestion. Double sugar, disaccharide, 2 hexagons. So I want you to know some examples of monosaccharides, examples of disaccharides, examples of poly, but you don't have to draw them. Okay, know some examples. When we get up into the longer chains, well, this is a really long chain. It's got a lot of monosaccharide hexagons. joined together. Those are polysaccharides. Poly for many, many sugars. These are your complex carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates. That's a lot of hexagons, that's a lot of bonds, that's a lot of energy, that's a lot of fuel. If you really need fuel, like a lot of energy, complex carbohydrates are better than the other two. Because wow, that's a lot of bonds. The place where we get these are mostly from plants. So starch, this is the chemical structure of starch. When you eat a potato in all its deliciousness, like here is a potato cell. I love this. Here's a potato cell. Here are these large blobs in there that are full of starch. Incredible numbers of bonds, incredible amount of energy. So good. So good. Or you know, if you're from rice culture, similar. Bread culture, similar. So plants store starch for themselves. We steal it to eat it. So do animals. So for plants, starch is the major polysaccharide that we steal from them. Animals also make polysaccharide in a form called glycogen. Glycogen. And I don't think that you talk about glycogen in AMP1, but we talk about it in AMP2. So glycogen in people is our major carbohydrate storage form. We build this and then we use it up. So if we eat mono or disaccharides and we don't need to burn them right away, we can use them to build glycogen stores, and we keep the glycogen in just two places. So some is in the liver, some is in skeletal muscles. If you do one of those sports where you're supposed to like carbo load the night before the thing, you're building up your glycogen stores so that tomorrow, it's usually tomorrow, you've got like boom, 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 boom. You break monosaccharides off of this and use them for energy. Good concept. Useful. You do need to remember glycogen is in the liver and muscles. Like for this lecture and then in the future. It's animal storage form of carbohydrate. Does this look the same? Like, does that look the same as starch? If you look at the shapes. It's kind of the same, but glycogen is branched. Like it's multi-branched more than starch. So when you run out of energy during a race or whatever, like you've got so many ends to cut sugars off of. You can use this up very fast. Whereas starch, you can only cut off from the ends. You can only get one at a time. Glycogen is branched, so you can access sugar out of it really quickly. And then there's another polysaccharide that comes from plants, and it's called cellulose. Cellulose. That's what their cell walls are made out of, is cellulose. And then we steal those for paper and wood to burn. We use cellulose also. If you go back, we call it fiber. We'll get to that in a minute. If you go back and look here, here's the cell wall. It's largely made out of cellulose. When we eat the potato, we can use this, and we eat the walls too, but we can't do anything with the cellulose in the walls because we can't break these bonds. We don't have the enzymes to break these bonds. That's so important. I'm going to pull up the screen and write that. So this looks simpler. It's just like a lot of hexagons in a straight row. But these bonds, we can't break those bonds that separate the single sugars because we lack the enzymes to do it. We lack the right enzymes. These molecules don't just magically fall apart for us. We have to have an enzyme for every bond we dismantle. That's why the details of glycolysis are so awful. It's like, well, you got this enzyme that does this thing, and then the next one, and then number 10 does this. There's 11. That didn't come up in this class, but to break covalent bonds, you basically have to have an enzyme to do every single one. We don't have this kind of enzyme, but we do have starch breaking and glycogen breaking enzymes. So we can eat cellulose, and hopefully, I hope you eat some cellulose. I hope you get some fiber. All of those unbreakable bonds pass through your digestive system unbroken and make you regular. We'll talk more about that when we get to the large intestine. It's really important, it's really helpful. It happens because we cannot break down that kind of bond. Here are some ways to break cellulose. Ruminants. So these are animals that can eat grass and live off of it. They can break down cellulose. Actually, it's not them, it's bacteria that live in their stomachs. That's cool. It's not them, it's their bacteria. We don't have those bacteria. Termites. Oh, that explains a lot. Termites, it's not them, it's their bacteria. They have bacteria in their primitive gut. I don't know that much about termite guts. They're breaking down wood cellulose. So the termites could get energy out of wood because they steal a little bit from the bacteria in their gut. Same for ruminants. Ruminants. Here's your non-A&P word of the day, ruminants, because they chew the cud. You're like ruminate, you ever ruminate and like keep going over something in your mind? That comes from this cud chewing, like you just keep turning it over and over. Like if you ruminate on a sad chapel. Guess what else? Guess what else can break down cellulose? Fungi. So when mushrooms grow on a log, they are dissolving the bonds out of the cellulose, out of the wood in the log, and they use it for energy. They've got those enzymes. We don't. I'm going to move on from that. That's not a life process. It's not a life process. So all of those categories are carbohydrates. I'm going to go back through those. So polysaccharide, fiber, it is a carbohydrate. Glycogen is, starch is, disaccharides are, and monosaccharides are. So all of those chemicals, including their individual names, all of those are carbohydrates. And I want to go back to the nutrition label too. Where'd it go? Way back. So total carbohydrates, that includes every kind that's in the food. Fiber, it's in there, it's going to go on through. That's cellulose, basically. And then total sugars, that's mono, let's write that on there. Total sugars is mono and disaccharides. This tells you how much of that did they add into the food artificially. That's kind of a new thing on nutrition labels. Everything that's not that 16, so fiber is 4 grams, total sugars is 12 grams, including that. That's 16. The rest of the 37 minus 16 is going to be complex carb. They just don't, like, you can't make this endlessly long. But the complex polysaccharides are what's left. All of those are carbohydrates. What's the building block? Monosaccharides. Simple sugars. Why do we need carbohydrates? Energy. We use them for energy, basically. How do we get them? We get them by eating foods that contain them. And I feel like, I don't know, students in general have pretty good knowledge about what food has carbs, although they may not know really a lot about carbs, but
Anything good.
that's how I feel, pretty much. Anything good. So your plant-derived starches, if it's wheat, rice, potato-based, corn as well, it's going to have carbohydrates in it. Okay. This is kind of some side information which is interesting. So one of our major sweeteners in the West is something called high fructose corn syrup. And fructose is a monosaccharide. My eraser. Fructose is a monosaccharide. And most of the fructose that we eat in this country is from corn syrup. Is from corn syrup. And so we grow corn, we process it to get starch. This is in a factory, by the way. Break down the starch into glucose, which is already kind of sugary. Fructose tastes better, so we chemically convert it to fructose, and then we put it in foods as a syrup form. So we're growing corn to get sugar, and we're processing corn into sugar, and then we eat sugar. It would be better to eat the corn nutritionally. How else do we get sugar for foods? What's the other source? Like, what does Mexican Coke have that American sugar? Cane sugar. So with cane sugar, if I drew a sugar beet right here, sugar beet, getting the sugar out of it, it doesn't take as much. Why are we so corn obsessed?
We have
It's
more
easy to
corn.
grow.
We can grow a lot of corn cheap. Yeah, we can grow a lot of corn cheap. People say Mexican Coke tastes better. I've not ever sat down and had them side by side. Okay, so here's, I didn't need to go back to this picture, I put it in again. Okay, so here, this is how your book talks about carbohydrates, which is why I put more pictures in. Okay, so here's some carbohydrates, and we digest them into monosaccharides, and then this is what we do with the monosaccharides. So this is a useful picture that I want to write a few more things about. What we do with carbohydrates in the end. So here's the energy. We can use them for energy. We build glycogen with the extra. Like if we're good with energy right now and we eat extra carbohydrates and turn them into monosaccharides, we'll glycogen load. And if our glycogen stores are good and we've got even more monosaccharides available, we will build fat with the extra. And that's a thing that you probably have heard before, but this is called lipogenesis, lipid build. Glycogenesis, glycogen build. But this is the order. This is the order of what we do with carbohydrates. So first, cellular energy. Second, build up glycogen stores. Third, build up fat stores. Those are the fates of carbohydrates generally. Also, right on here, up here where it says digestion, we need to remember that that's going to require digestive enzymes. So when we talk about digestive system, there's going to be certain enzymes in the stomach, certain enzymes in the small intestine, certain ones in the pancreas. We need those to break down poly and disaccharides into the simple ones. Right, one more thing on here, which is that it's the monosaccharides. Those are the ones that can actually be absorbed. we've got to get the small, simple sugars form to be able to make it out of the space inside your gut into your small intestine, into your bloodstream. If you just eat these straight away, that's quick energy. You get a sucker that's going to give you a quick energy. These others, you get overall more energy out of it, but you have to break it down into these to get it absorbed. It takes longer, yeah. It takes longer. If somebody is diabetic and having a blood sugar emergency, like, here, have a potato. No, we don't do that. It's like, here, have some candy right now. This will help you quickly. But that's carbohydrates generally. Oh man, okay. Taking too long. This may go over into Monday. Okay, so next let's talk about second big category, which is lipids. I'm going to skip a few slides here because I started to take these out anyway. So skip this one and this one.
It's like we don't need to know anything on this.
No. I want to go straight to here. So we classify lipids by saying that they're things that don't dissolve in water. Fine. Those two slides are about why they don't dissolve in water. We can get by without knowing this for this class. Lipids have a lot of carbon-hydrogen bonds. They don't dissolve very well, but they have a lot of bonds. So what I want to write in general about lipids is that per gram, lipids have the most bonds, so they have the most energy, which also means they have the most calories per gram. And you may have learned that before. Like back in the day, like 4 iterations ago, Weight Watchers, they made public this formula. And it was like, this is the points per, this is how you calculate Weight Watcher points out of your food. So you take the fat grams and you multiply it by 9.
For our nutrition class, we have to do like diets. And
Yeah.
our group did that one.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and then for carbohydrate it was 4, and protein I forgot because that's my least favorite to eat. But lipids as a group have the most bonds per gram, and they're the most the most energy dense. Here's important concept number 2. In carbon chains, so if we're just looking at straight pure hydrocarbon chains where you've got carbon, hydrogen, and what these really are showing, draw that in. So when it says CH2, CH2, really the hydrogens are hanging off the side like this. But when you have single bonds between carbons, they make a straight line. If you have double bonds between carbons, that's a different bond angle, and it will make the chain bend. You learn this in the chemistry that you take? Like, I think you do, but this is where it becomes kind of relevant for people. So
the double bond makes the angle.
yeah, the double bond forms an angle in the chain. And so if we've got a chain that's all single covalent bonds, it's straight, it's in a straight line. Every place where you have a double bond within one of these hydrocarbon chains, that introduces a kinked line. The other thing to write about this slide is that it's this right here. This is a picture of a triglyceride, which is a particular type of lipid that people tend to have a lot of. Triglyceride.
The red or yellow?
All of it together. That's a really good question. All of it together is triglyceride. Just the red is glycerol. So glad you said that. Just the red is glycerol. It's going to help later. These three yellow things are fatty acid chains. Like when I first heard of fatty acids, I was like, whoa, that sounds really complicated. Fatty acids are like the most chemically simple thing in life chemistry. They're just a bunch of hydrocarbons, and then on out here they would have an acid group. So 3 fatty acids combined with a glycerol, that's triglyceride. And when we measure people's body lipids, we check triglycerides in their blood. How fatty is your blood? What is your triglyceride level? So fats, what we call fats, will have a lot of those triglycerides. And if the triglycerides have straight chains, we call that a saturated fatty acid or a saturated fat. Saturated fats are solid at room temperature. So stuff like butter, lard, the fat off of a, what is that, a beef roast? Kind of looks like a rib roast. Anyway, solid milk fat. Don't get off track. I haven't had lunch. Solid fats, saturated fats, single bonds. And because they are straight chains, these can pack together like, if you're making a pile of straws, you can pack them together tightly. That's why they stay solid at room temperature. And it also makes them more likely to, if you've got too many of this type of triglyceride or this type of fatty acid, it's more clogging for your arteries. That's why we say that they're harmful to health. Saturated fat. Fats that have double bonds in the chain, and please draw a circle around this. This is kind of stuck. It's not, shouldn't be in here. Margarine and donut. Please draw a circle around that and put it with trans fat, which is a separate concept. So these plant oils and omega-3s, these are unsaturated fats. They are liquidy at room temperature. That's what makes salmon taste like so melt in your mouth, because the fat in it is basically liquid in between the proteins. Oils and nuts, those are also unsaturated fats. They're liquid because you can't pack a lot of this tight together. It's just too bent. It's too bent. And so they're liquid at room temperature, are not as cloggy in your arteries, and they're healthier. But that's what saturated fats are chemically. It's possible to take cheap oils, plant oils, unsaturated, and in a factory, turn these into single bonds. So look at this spot. Well, they're using every single spot. I'm going to look right here. So there's some double bonds between those two carbons. That's carbons 3 and 4. So that is being turned into this. So when the double bond converts to a single, you've got extra bondability to put a hydrogen there on that carbon and a hydrogen there. And so let's circle the new one. There's the new hydrogen. There's the new hydrogen. That process is called hydrogenation. Hydrogenation. It's done in a factory. To take cheap, it's basically a way to make cheap saturated fat, like the cheap plant oil, and then turn it into Crisco, basically. What do you call vegetable shortening in the UK? Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. So. Like here we just call it Crisco. It's like white and in a tub, and we make biscuits with it, American biscuits. Maybe no one uses it. Maybe it's just an American aberration, but anyway, that's what a trans fat is. This is called a trans addition across that bond. So trans fat went from unsaturated to saturated in a factory via hydrogenation, and for some reason that's bad for human health. Like even worse it appears than if you just used butter from the start or lard from the start. I don't know why, but that's what a trans fat is. And so one other category of lipids classified kind of together with fats is cholesterol. So quite different structure, really different structure. We've got 6 and 5-sided rings and then some hydrocarbon hanging off the end. So this is cholesterol. Cholesterol gets a bad reputation, but we really, really need it to make certain things in our body. Every steroid that's in our body is derived from cholesterol. So we use cholesterol to make these important things. Steroids, steroid hormones. We need it for nutrient absorption. And we also need cholesterol to build plasma membranes. It's really critical for that. Build plasma membranes. It's a membrane stabilizer. All of them derive from cholesterol. Cholesterol is chemically classified as a lipid because it doesn't dissolve in water. Okay, to go back to our nutrition label now, and to go back to the 4 big questions about lipids. What's the first question? The building blocks. Lipids don't have a monomer. Lipids don't have a monomer polymer structure. They're just really diverse. So that we're not so much taking little individual pieces of something and building it into a lipid or building it into cholesterol. They don't really have that capability. Why do we need them? One way you can think about it is, are there drawbacks to being fat-free in your diet? We don't need them as much as other molecules, but what we use them for, we use them for energy. We need them for nutrient absorption. Next time we'll talk about there are these certain fat-soluble vitamins. Like they have to dissolve in fat, so if you don't eat them with fat, you can't absorb them, basically. Membrane building. Membrane building. How do we get them in our diet? We get them from eating animal fat and plant fat. And omega-3s fall into both of those categories. So let's look again at the nutrition label. We've got total fat, saturated, because that's the less healthy kind. We're required now to, in the US, put how much trans fat is there because it's dangerous. What's not listed here? Unsaturated. Unsaturated plus unclassified fat. Lipids and triglycerides and cholesterol are not the only kinds of fats there are, but saturated we pull out, trans fat we pull out just to warn people, oh, watch out. This has unhealthy fats in it. Cholesterol they put on a separate line. it's still technically a lipid. It goes with the lipid group. This picture from your book is slightly boring, but it's saying, what do we do with fat? What do we do with fats in our body? The major form that we digest are the triglycerides, which is glycerol and fatty acids linked together. The first step to digest them is just to break them off. Break off the fatty acids, break off the glycerol. And then your liver, this is the liver, your liver is going to use those to build all of this other stuff. And when we start learning about the liver, this concept of the liver turning your dietary triglycerides into all of these other things, I say that your liver does lipid conversions. What's lipid conversions? It's your liver building phospholipids for your membranes. If you don't have enough cholesterol, you can kind of build some from triglycerides to go along with what you eat in your diet. Your liver will make certain kinds of fatty acids that you need elsewhere in your body. Lipoproteins, this is HDL, LDL that we talked about. We talked about that in here, right? Good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. Good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. And then it will rebuild triglycerides if you need them at the moment. Your liver is huge for building you what are the lipids that you need today, right now. It's one of its major jobs. This next picture is another slightly irritating flowchart, but important, because I want to highlight some certain things from this. So we eat fats, we digest them. You could write digestion right here. We digest them. We break apart the fatty acid chains and the glycerol. We can use glycerol to build sugar. That's cool. We can use glycerol to build sugar. So if you're doing a low